It wasn't an accident. It was a trap. I used to believe family would always be the safest place, until my very own nephew stood behind the balcony door, and the latch had been pushed and locked from the inside. A fall from the second floor, a shattered pelvis, fractured spine, and trust destroyed. The worst part wasn't the fall. It was lying on the ground, writhing in pain, while they just stood there, criticizing me, blaming me. If you've ever been shoved into the pit by your own flesh and blood only to have them turn their backs, hit subscribe to Revenge Mark, because here, I'll tell you how I got back up and gave back every ounce of pain they once left me with. That day, I had only meant to step out onto the balcony to hang the laundry. Late summer sunlight poured down on the 3-story house on the east side of Columbus, Ohio. My sister Lorraine Kingsley, the woman who always preached about charity, was brewing tea in the kitchen. My brother-in-law Walter was scrolling through the news on his iPad as he did every day, and Mason, my 14-year-old nephew, was sitting there playing video games, eyes glued to the screen. I turned the balcony door handle. It was hard to open. Something was caught in the latch. I leaned in a bit, trying to push harder. The sliding door gave way. I had barely stepped out when bang! The door slammed shut behind me. Startled, I turned around, but the handle was locked tight. No wind, no loose latch. Someone had wedged the lock from the inside. My heart pounded. I knocked hard on the glass. Mason, open the door for me. No answer. I pressed my shoulder into the door. No use. The wind started picking up. The drying rack tilted. I turned to grab the pole. Everything went into slow motion. The sole of my foot slipped off a loose tile, and I fell. Pain tore through my body like an electric storm. I heard a sharp crack, like a branch snapping in two. My vision blurred. My chest tightened. I didn't scream. I didn't have the breath left to. I could only gasp. And then they appeared. Walter stepped out first. His eyes didn't blink, staring at me as if I were some trapped animal. Lorraine stood behind him, teacup in hand. Oh my God! Naomi! What stupid thing did you do now, she said, as if I had just slipped on the kitchen floor instead of falling from the second floor. I tried to lift my hand, wanting them to come closer. I can't move. My back. Walter shrugged. Probably just a sprain. You brought it on yourself, hanging laundry so slowly. No one called 911. No one bent down to check if I was even alive. They left me there, on the burning hot tiles, broken and alone. That night, the neighbor next door, Mrs. Diana Connors, brought over her camera footage. Mason, standing right behind me, leaning down, placing a pencil into the track of the sliding balcony door. He smiled, then walked away. Not accidental. Not some silly prank. Deliberate. And Lorraine still said the same thing at dinner the next night. While I lay there immobile, Naomi only fell because she was careless. Don't blow things out of proportion. Kids will be kids. I lay there, silent. But inside me, something began to rise. Not pain, but anger. Can I ever forgive them, or will I make each and every one of them repay that cold-blooded debt I woke up in a cold, white room? My leg was suspended in a sling. My hips were tightly wrapped in a hard plastic brace. My whole body felt numb, as if someone had laid stones across my chest. I asked the nurse, "How long have I been unconscious?" She answered, 2 days. They brought you in at midnight, saying you fell down the stairs. Stairs. My throat tightened. I fell from the second-floor balcony, not down the stairs. I wanted to scream, but I didn't have the strength. There was no sign of Lorraine. No Walter, no Mason. Only the hospital bill lay coldly on the table. No handwriting, no note. And I lay there, my spine fractured in pieces, but my heart hurt more than my bones. The doctor said, "You'll need physical therapy for at least 6 months. You might walk slowly for a whole year." I pressed my lips together and nodded, but inside, it felt like someone had just turned off the light. I had no home of my own, no insurance, no income. I was living in my sister's house. And now, even getting out of bed felt like something far out of reach. In those first days in the hospital, I would stare at the ceiling, just wishing for a knock at the door. Not from a nurse, but from someone familiar. My sister. A hug, an apology, a tear, nothing. My phone, which had shattered from the fall, had been left by Lorraine in a torn bag. No one called, no one texted. Mrs. Diana Connors was the only one who came to visit. She brought a USB drive. Inside was footage from a security camera. "Did my nephew really do it?" I asked, my voice trembling. She gave a slight nod. Not only did he do it, he laughed. I broke down in tears. I couldn't stop. Not because of the pain, but because of that cold smile from Mason. It wasn't the mischievous grin of a child. It was the look of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. I thought about Lorraine, about the way she looked at me that day when I was lying on the ground. Not a flicker of sympathy. I thought about all the times I washed dishes after dinner, did the family's laundry, took Mason to extra classes, did things no one asked me to do, just because I thought I still had some worth. Maybe I was wrong. One night, unable to sleep, I overheard the doctor and a nurse talking in the hallway. Her family isn't answering the phone. The hospital has no choice but to hold on to the bill. I turned my face to the wall. My heart didn't hurt anymore. It was empty. I started to wonder, was Lorraine keeping me in the hospital so I wouldn't be in her way? Was this so-called accident their easiest way of getting rid of me? A crippled woman with no home, no power, no voice. Did they think I would quietly fade from their lives like the last stubborn stain finally wiped away? I used to be someone who only wanted love. Now, I just want to look them in the eye and make them remember every wound I've carried. But to do that, I have to stand up first. And to stand up, I need a reason to fight. I remember clearly the afternoon when everything changed. It was raining. Heavy rain pounded hard enough that the hospital room's windows rattled with every gust of wind. I was learning to use crutches for the first time after 3 weeks. Every step felt like a knife slicing into my hip. I tried to stifle my groans, but the tears refused to be contained. The nurse turned away, leaving me alone. In the small mirror attached to the bedside cabinet, I saw myself gaunt, greasy hair, cracked lips, eyes completely devoid of light. I whispered, "Naomi, you look like you're already dead." And I believed it, until I heard voices in the hallway. Lorraine. Her voice sounded as if nothing had happened. "She's still not out of the hospital yet. No longer Naomi, no longer my sister." Walter replied curtly. "The doctor said if she does the rehab on her own, maybe another 2 months. But the hospital bills are eating up a lot. I think we should cut it short." I froze. My sister. the one who once held me after my divorce, who once told me we were bound by blood, was now discussing cutting hospital costs as casually as turning off the power. When they walked past my door, I didn't bother pretending to be asleep anymore. I looked straight at Lorraine, and I asked, without a hint of trembling, "Did you come to see if I'm dead yet?" Lorraine stopped. Then she smiled, a thin smile, sharp as a razor. "You always make such a big deal out of everything. Naomi, the doctor said you're not seriously hurt." I leaned over, pulled the X-ray results from the bedside drawer, and tossed them onto the bed. 4 broken bones, 2 fractured vertebrae. That's not serious. She said nothing. Walter glanced at me with disdain. "Stop acting. Kids play around, and you feel that you're clumsy. Don't use that as an excuse to cling to our house forever." That was the moment. I stopped hurting. I got angry. Not angry about the fall, but angry because they thought I would never dare to fight back. They believed I was weak, that I had no one on my side, that I would forever be the obedient shadow in the kitchen, never raising my voice. That night, I replayed the video from Mrs. Connor's home security camera for the 12th time. Mason wedged the balcony door latch with a pencil, bent down, smiled. I paused the video right there. His eyes lit up, like he was carrying out a plan he'd prepared in advance. A week later, I asked the hospital to call one person Jacob Alvarez, an old college friend, now a civil attorney in Columbus. When he walked in, I was already waiting, my hand resting on a thick folder. "I don't want money. I want my dignity back. And the truth." Jacob looked at me, silent for a long moment. Then he said, "Your sister has no idea how much you've changed, Naomi." I smiled for the first time in weeks, not because I felt better, but because I knew this was the start of my pushback. The 2nd month after the accident, I began learning how to stand tall, not just with my legs, but with my will. Mallory, my physical therapist, a Mexican woman not even 5'3", was the first to teach me how to keep my head up when I walked. If you walk like you're apologizing, you'll spend your whole life receiving nothing but contempt. I listened. I remembered. I applied it. I began making a list, not a shopping list, but a list of wounds. Every word Lorraine had said, every smirk from Walter, every time. Mason feigned innocence. I wrote them all down in a small leather notebook I kept tucked under my pillow. Each line was a milestone, a reminder that I could not back down. Jacob, the only lawyer who believed I hadn't fallen by accident, came to visit every week. He didn't just bring case files, he brought hope. We can't sue a minor like Mason, but we can sue his parents for negligence and for covering up evidence. I nodded. I don't want to make them apologize. I want them to face their guilt, publicly, in court. I began transforming from the inside out. I relearned how to use a computer after my wrist injury. I looked up legal codes myself, getting familiar with the terms Jacob mentioned in every meeting. I cut my hair short, got rid of the dull ash gray, and dyed it a deep brown. I hired an old friend to redesign my resume and started applying for remote jobs, even in a wheelchair. I worked. I still wrote, still studied, still prepared. One afternoon, as I wheeled myself outside the hospital, the first snow of the season began to fall. It was freezing, but I smiled because I could feel I was alive. 3 months after the accident, I was officially discharged from the hospital. I didn't go back to Lorraine's house. I went to stay with Mrs. Connors, the neighbor who had provided the very first piece of evidence. She gave me the room her granddaughter used to stay in every summer. You're the only one in this neighborhood brave enough to take on the Kingsleys. So stay here and fight. That first night in my new room, I opened my laptop. I sent my first email to Kingsley and Associates, Walter's law firm. Just one line. The video from that day, I have the original, and I'm not staying silent anymore. The next morning, I went to a tailor near Elm Street. I asked them to alter my old black dress, the last thing I still had from before the accident. Not for a funeral, but for my reappearance. As someone Lorraine would no longer recognize, I arranged to meet Lorraine at a cafe across from City Hall. For the first time since I fell from that balcony, she looked at me without a smile. Maybe because I no longer bowed my head. Maybe because this time I had a lawyer with me. Have you ever been called a leech, a burden, that woman? Then stay, because I'm about to let them know. I'm the one who recorded everything. Subscribe to Revenge Mark if you believe justice can come from someone who's been thrown to the ground and then got back up. Lorraine didn't greet me when I arrived. She didn't ask, "How have you been?" She just sat there, coffee gone cold, eyes scanning every stitch on the black dress I was wearing. I sat down, looked her straight in the eye. "I'm not here to blame you. I'm here to warn you." She laughed, the kind of laugh from someone who no longer sees you as family. "Naomi, what do you think you're doing?" I opened my iPad. The video started playing, slowly, no sound. Mason bent down, slid a pencil into the groove of the balcony door, then walked away. The door slammed shut. I disappeared from the frame. I didn't say a word. I just watched Lorraine's expression change by the second. An hour later, the anonymous site justicehollow.org was updated. Headline: "The balcony door doesn't close itself," and the story of a cold-blooded family below was the footage from Mrs. Connor's home security camera, with exact timestamps, location, and the hospital's medical report. No direct mention of Mason's name, but the last name, Kingsley, was clearly visible in the case management section captured from the law firm's website. Jacob called me that evening. The site got more than 3,000 views in just the first 2 hours. I stayed silent. "Naomi, are you ready? Because this time, they're going to strike back." I answered in the calmest voice I've ever used. "I don't need them to apologize. I just need people to see me. Not as that woman, but as the one they pushed from the second floor." The next morning, Lorraine texted me, "How many more dirty tricks are you planning? Mason is just a kid. He didn't mean it. You're destroying my family." I didn't respond, because the truth is not a dirty trick. What's dirty is their silence. A local reporter from the Columbus Ledger emailed me, just one line: "Willing to talk. Your story is worth a wider audience." I typed back slowly, "Not yet, but I'm just getting started." Jacob filed a petition with the district court, requesting a review for willful neglect of a victim in a serious accident, with additional evidence from the neighbor's security camera. A week later, Walter's office received notice. The Kingsley and Associates file was being referred for an ethics investigation. No one in the legal field wants their name next to the words evidence suppression. That afternoon, Lorraine came to find me. No warning. Knocked on Mrs. Connor's door. I opened it. She wasn't wearing makeup anymore. No shiny blazer. Just a tired, middle-aged woman with cracked lips and deep-set eyes. She threw a question at me. "How much do you want? I stood still. You think this is about money? She clenched her fists. Then what do you want? I answered, one word at a time, like hammering nails into an old wooden plank. An admission, in front of others, that I didn't fall. I was pushed, and I was left behind. She turned and walked away, said nothing more, but I saw her shoulders tremble, not from the cold, but because for the first time, she knew I was no longer the Naomi she used to know, and this was only the first blow. The first message from Walter came on a Monday morning, just one line, in that classic lawyer's tone of control, stop immediately or prepare to face legal consequences. I didn't reply. I took a screenshot, sent it to Jacob. Less than an hour later, he texted back, he's trying to intimidate you. But what he doesn't know is that we're already preparing a countersuit. I knew Walter wasn't the kind of man to sit still. 3 days later, I got a notice from the HR department of the law firm where I had just applied for a position. We regret to inform you that we cannot move forward with your application due to concerns about your legal history and potential media controversy surrounding your name. I bit my lip. Not surprised. Walter had friends all over the industry. One phone call was enough to cost me a job before I even started. That afternoon, Jacob called me into his office. His face was tight as a bowstring. Naomi, someone just filed a countersuit against you. They're claiming you defamed a minor, damaging the family's reputation. I frowned. I have the video. I know. But they're going after your weak spot, your emotions. They want to twist the story into an unstable woman trying to get revenge on her family. I went silent. Every part of me wanted to scream that I was the victim, but I also knew the world has never believed people without power. 2 days later, someone sent an anonymous email to justicehollow.org, the site I had once used. The content read, Naomi Whitaker was diagnosed with depression in 2017. She should never have been living with a minor. They started digging into my past. They weren't aiming at the fall anymore. They were aiming at my character. I found myself standing in front of the mirror, again. No longer the fragile woman in the hospital bed, but not someone invincible either. I trembled. Afraid. A question echoed in my mind: if they truly destroy me, who will still believe me that evening? Lorraine showed up again. She didn't knock. She just called my name from the yard. I stepped out. She stood there, arms crossed, her face cold as ice. You think you're smart. Naomi, no. Don't stay silent anymore. You think bringing a lawyer is enough. Never thought it was. Good, because you're gonna need more than a lawyer. You're gonna need a miracle. I looked at her for a long time, and I smiled, softly, but deep enough to make her step back half a pace. I don't need a miracle. I just need the truth and patience. That night, someone threw a rock through Mrs. Connor's window. Shards were scattered across the living room floor. I sat still in the dark, watching tiny drops of blood seep from her palm. She had started picking up the glass before putting on gloves. I shook, not out of fear, but because I understood this fight was no longer just mine. A week after the stone shattered Mrs. Connor's window, the Columbus Ledger ran its first article. The headline hit like a hammer: a woman falls from a balcony, and the truth hidden in Kingsley neighborhood. Alongside it was a still image from the video: Naomi Whitaker, petite, standing before the courtroom door, head held high. The spotlight caught the hip brace still visible beneath her long dress. I didn't read the article alone. I opened it on Mrs. Connor's computer the moment it went live. She sat frozen. And me? I didn't cry. I laughed. Not out of satisfaction, but because finally someone had written my name without slapping that woman next to it. On social media, people shared I've been in Naomi's situation before. No one believed me. This story needs to be heard. The way that kid smiled in the video, chilling. And the mother still defended him. Unreal. Walter Kingsley. I've worked with him before. Not surprised at all. 3 days later, a real estate company canceled its legal contract with Walter's law firm, worth nearly $300,000. That evening, Walter was asked to step down from the city's Bar Association Ethics Committee. Lorraine went silent. No more messages. Jacob walked into my house with a rare smile. We're winning, Naomi. The evidence, public opinion, even the system is leaning your way. I asked, hesitantly, do you think this time I'll be believed not because I'm a victim, but because I'm right? He didn't answer immediately. He just placed his hand on the file on the table. You are right. And this time, they can't dodge it. I walked for the first time in nearly 4 months. Slow. Still painful, but no wheelchair. Each step was a loud, steady thump in my chest. People on the street recognized me. An elderly woman nodded. A young man, phone in hand, whispered to his friend, "That's the woman from the article?" I didn't look away. I looked straight ahead, kept walking. That night, I opened my old notebook again. On the first page, it read, I will not be forgotten. I crossed that line out, wrote beneath it, and I will not let them keep hurting others. The next morning, a new email popped up in my inbox. Sender Mason High School. The content was brief. Due to the impact of recent events, the school board is suspending Mason Kingsley for 10 days pending investigation. We deeply regret not taking action sooner. I wasn't thrilled. I didn't want the boy to be hurt. I just wanted someone to finally act. And today, they did. That afternoon, Jacob came in with a new stack of documents. His expression was no longer as light as in the morning. Naomi, they just hired a major law firm from New York. They're preparing to countersue, this time for defamation and financial damages. I clenched my fists. A counter-strike. And they're going big. Very big. I turned toward the mirror in front of me, not to check my reflection, but to remind myself I've come this far. There's no turning back now. On a Tuesday morning, my inbox was flooded with more than 300 emails overnight. The subject lines kept repeating, "Response to your false article. Are you making up stories just to get famous? I trusted you? Not anymore." I clicked on one. Inside was a photo of me sitting in a bar, a place I had visited years ago with Jacob, before the accident happened. The picture had been cropped. It looked like we were close, my head resting on his shoulder. Along with the caption, Naomi Whitaker, a woman with a history of emotional disorders, using her relationship with a lawyer to profit off her family. I exhaled, but my hands were shaking. The camera angle, the wording, everything was set up like a trap. Jacob walked in at 11 a.m. His face was tense. Someone leaked your old medical records. I looked up. What right do they have to touch that? No one has that right. But when you've hired a big law firm, they can buy anything, and they want to break you. By 3 p.m. that day, the Justice Hollow org account was suspended for unverified privacy violation complaints. All posts, images, and videos were temporarily removed. People started doubting me. Some journalists who had once been on my side deleted their articles. Some followers messaged my inbox asking, "Are you really a victim? Why did you stay silent for years if it was that serious and worse?" That night, I heard glass shatter for the second time. Mrs. Connors wasn't home. She was visiting her daughter in Florida. I stepped out onto the porch. On the cement lay a shattered glass bottle. Inside was a crumpled note, stuffed in haste. "Shut your mouth, Naomi. Next time, it won't be the window." I held the paper, trying not to shake, but tears still welled up. I went back inside, locked the door with 3 bolts, sat on the floor, back against the wall, breathing hard. It had been a long time since I'd felt this small. I called Jacob. His voice was urgent. "You shouldn't be alone tonight. I'll have a friend move you right away. This isn't about legal retaliation anymore." I clenched my fists, but my mind was spinning because more than fear, I felt myself losing control again. The next morning, I woke up at a friend of Jacob's, a former cop. He showed me a printout from a private group chat. "Whitaker is on the 3rd floor of Cooper's house. Back door is unlocked." My throat tightened. Someone was tracking me closely. Just when I thought I couldn't be more drained, my phone rang. It was the local hospital. The doctor's voice on the other end was slow. "We want to inform you that Mrs. Connors was brought into the ER this morning from a car accident. She's unconscious." I froze. Accident. Yes. Her car was rear-ended, and there were no skid marks from the vehicle that hit her. My chest constricted. This wasn't just retaliation. This was a warning. A real threat. Blood. And for the first time since leaving the hospital, I thought about giving up. Only for a second. But it was cold enough for me to understand if I don't rise now, they won't just destroy my reputation, they'll destroy the people I love. I sat there, on the cold metal chair in the ICU, my hand loosely holding Mrs. Connors' wrist, mottled with bruises. The bleeding had stopped, but her breathing was still fragile. Her heart was beating, but her eyes had never opened. The police told me it might have been an accident. The driver fled the scene. No license plate. The traffic camera happened to malfunction. I listened without reacting, like a breathing corpse. I just sat there, staring at the same aged fingers that once towel-dried my hair, now cold as candle wax. I thought, what have I done when I left the hospital? A light drizzle was falling. I had no umbrella. I didn't go back to Mr. Cooper's place. I didn't go back to anyone's place. I walked for 2 blocks straight into an old motel I had once hidden in for a night, long ago, after a fight with Lorraine. The room still had that same stale smell. The paint was still peeling. The sheets are still rough. Only this time, I collapsed without being able to cry. I turned on my phone, turned off the Wi-Fi, turned off location, turned off the ringer. The screen flashed the words, "No one can find you." And I thought, good. I sat on the cold floor, knees drawn up, my back against the bed. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't thirsty. I just felt empty. No more anger, no more resolve, no more purpose. Only one question kept gnawing at me. What if I had just kept my mouth shut from the beginning? I used to think I was strong because I dared to speak up. But that night, I just felt foolish. A failed woman who thought a few articles and video clips could take down the entire Kingsley family. And the result, Mrs. Connors is in the hospital. Jacob threatened. Me smeared. Even Mason. A kid not old enough to drive, was now being used as an excuse for the whole system to twist the truth. I thought about disappearing, truly disappearing. No lawsuits, no resistance, no reason for them to ever say my name again. But before that thought could take root, I remembered Lorraine's face. The last time she stood at my door. That look, that voice, that sentence, "You're going to need a miracle." A miracle. No, I didn't need a miracle. I just needed not to quit. I turned on the room light. The brightness stabbed at my eyes. I pulled my backpack from under the bed, taking out the old notebook I used to write in when I was in the hospital. The first page read, "Don't let the fall be the end." I had once believed in those words. I read them again as if they were the last message from a stronger version of myself, one I had left somewhere in the middle of a storm. I turned my phone back on, Wi-Fi on, ringer on. A message from Jacob popped up. "Naomi, Mrs. Connors is out of danger. You're not alone." I bit my lip, didn't cry, just whispered thank you. But I need to believe that one more time. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew this. If I were still alive, I would still fight. Not for revenge anymore, but because someone needed to see that. Even when they break you in two, you can still stand up. If you've ever fallen into the pit of isolation, ever wished you could just disappear from other people's lives, remember this: your very existence is the strongest act of resistance. Subscribe to Revenge Mark, because I'm still here, telling the rest of the life they once tried to bury. I came back from the motel close to noon. Jacob met me out in the yard. He didn't ask anything. He just handed me a cup of hot coffee. His hand trembled slightly. The coffee rippled against the lid. I took it, looked at him, and said, "This time, I'm not walking away." He nodded. "No good luck." "No, you're so strong. Just presence." And that was enough. That afternoon, I went to the hospital. Mrs. Connors was awake. Her eyes still couldn't open wide, but her hand squeezed mine gently. I thought, I had gotten you hurt. She drew in a weak breath. "And I think you're the reason I'm still alive." Those words felt like someone had just put my spine back in place. The spine of belief. I began reading through the entire case file again, leaving out nothing. I marked Walter's conflicting statements. I listed every time Lorraine had tried to dodge responsibility. I worked as if every single mistake was a stone paving the road back to justice. Jacob took me to meet an independent journalist, someone who had been sued by Kingsley and Associates 3 years ago. Her article had been wiped from the internet, but she still had the original. I read it, and I understood I wasn't the only one they had tried to bury. We built a new file, not just to sue, but to reopen every old case they had ever cleaned up with money and influence. One person stood behind me, then 2, then 5, a former employee, an intern, a past client. They started sending emails, started talking. That night, I went live for the first time. No big production, no professional lighting, just me, my old webcam, and one line. "If you've ever been turned into a liar just because someone else had more money, this video is for you." Over 20,000 views overnight. Not because I told a sob story, but because I dared to say real names, and I dared not be afraid anymore. Lorraine stayed silent. Walter had his lawyer send a threatening letter. I sent Jacob a copy of Walter's old recorded threat. And this time, we filed a formal lawsuit: obstruction of justice, abuse of influence, spreading false information. I wasn't just the person who got pushed off the balcony anymore. I was the one pushing back. One step at a time. The next morning, I received a package. No sender name. Inside was my old bracelet, the one I'd lost the day I fell from the second floor. Beside it was a note. Stop. Naomi. We know where you are. I set the bracelet on the table. No fear, no weakness. I just thought, this isn't a war for revenge anymore. This is a war to prove I deserve to live, and I will not die quietly. One thing I've learned after everything: revenge doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be on time. And that time is coming. The bracelet being sent wasn't meant to scare me. It was a reminder that I was on the right track, and the enemy was starting to feel afraid. I rewrote the entire timeline of events, from the first day I moved into Lorraine's house to the moment I ended up sprawled on the brick patio. I posted each timestamp on the wall with a red marker. I circled every point where their stories didn't match. Walter said I fell down the stairs. Lorraine claimed I went out to the balcony in the middle of the night to make a phone call. Mason said he couldn't remember, but Mrs. Connor's camera told a different story. I planned as if I were my own lawyer, not to win on emotion, but to leave them with no way to deny the truth. Jacob and I reached out to an independent investigative media group, the same team that had exposed a massive fake charity scandal in the neighboring state. We didn't send them the footage. We didn't send them witness statements. We sent them a scent trail of money. The financial report from Kingsley and Associates law firm, where Walter had siphoned funds from a client trust account to hire media handlers for a cleanup campaign. When the reporter asked me, "What do you want the public to know?" I answered, for the first time without hesitation, I don't want them to know who I am. I want them to know who they are. We began sending copies of the documents to people who had once stayed silent. We didn't ask them to speak up. We just wanted to wake their memories. And memory is the cruelest thing when you've stayed quiet for too long. One night, I stood in front of the wall of notes, scanning from left to right. In the very center, written in black ink, one single line: "Don't kill them with a knife. Kill them with the truth." I didn't sleep much, not because of fear, but because my head no longer held fear. It held a strategy. At 3:42 a.m., I sent Jacob an email: prepare for a hearing. Not for the old lawsuit, for the public event. We decided to hold a small press conference at the city library. No stage, no video screens, just me, sitting there, with printed chat logs from Walter's law firm's internal group, where they mocked victims and discussed media cleanup. Everything I had once kept hidden, I printed out in hard copy. I didn't shout. I'm the victim. I simply let them see themselves in their own words, their own actions, and their own silence. Lorraine didn't show up, but Walter sent someone to film the event. I spotted the lens peeking from behind a bookshelf. I looked straight at it. No flinch, no shake, and said one single line: "If I fall again this time, it will be on the stage of justice, and I accept that." The press conference ended, but I knew the final act was only about to begin. Walter wouldn't back down. Lorraine wouldn't stay silent forever. But me, I was done preparing. Franklin County Court, room 304-900 a.m. I sat alone in the last row, not because I was late, but because I had arrived too early. The smell of old wood, scattered footsteps. I looked up at the empty bench, sunlight streaming through the window, slicing across my palms like a cold blade. Jacob arrived at 8:37 carrying a black briefcase and a cup of peppermint tea. No coffee. He knew I didn't need my heart racing any faster this morning. He sat down next to me and said quietly, "They're here." I didn't ask who I knew. The door swung open. Walter Kingsley walked in like a trail of arrogant black smoke. Charcoal suit, deep red tie, a folder in his left hand. No need to look to know it was his counterattack script. Behind him, Lorraine. Different from every other time. No form-fitting dress, no bold lipstick. Just a woman, trying to hold on to the shape of power, and failing. They saw me. No smile, no nod. Only Walter's eyes lifted slightly, as if to say, "You're still here." I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I looked straight at him. And for the first time, he was the one who broke eye contact. The hearing hadn't started yet. We were ushered into a private assessment room where the judge would hear preliminary arguments from both sides. Walter's attorney, from New York, pale-skinned, voice steady like a reading machine. My client has suffered severe reputational damage, including the loss of 3 major contracts and financial damages exceeding $1 million due to baseless allegations made by the defendant. Jacob didn't react. He simply opened his laptop and projected a scanned copy of Walter's internal email, where he called me a worthless piece of trash to be dealt with quickly. Nothing more. The judge looked. No expression. But I saw. His eyes lingered just a little longer on the final lines of the email deal with her fast. Don't let her think she's somebody. By noon, the hearing was adjourned. I stepped into the hallway. Lorraine stood against the wall, alone. No trace of arrogance left. I walked over. No hatred, no performance. Just a face-to-face that should have happened long ago. Why, I asked. Just one word, but I knew she understood. Lorraine exhaled, eyes falling to the tiled floor. I always thought people were obligated to love me. I didn't respond, but my chest tightened. She went on. Walter didn't do to you anything he hasn't done to others. You were just the first one brave enough to speak out. I asked, my voice rough. And you still chose to stand behind him? Lorraine stayed silent for a long while, then turned and walked away. I stood there. The draft from the glass window at the end of the hall swept in, cold, but sobering. That afternoon, we returned to the courtroom. Walter didn't look at me anymore. He only spoke to his lawyer, then stepped back to his seat. Something in his eyes, no longer certain. The judge picked up our motion requesting a full investigation into the financial and ethical conduct of Kingsley and Associates. No one spoke. No one smiled. But I knew. The real confrontation was getting closer. Tomorrow, the court will open the formal trial. Lorraine, Walter, Mason, and I would face each other at the same time, in the same place. No blurry cameras, no rumors, only the truth and the choices each of us had made. And I had already made mine. I used to think that the day I faced them in court would be a dramatic, almost heroic scene. Tears, shouts, flashing lights from the press. But in reality, it was strangely quiet. Only the soft tap of high heels on the worn stone floor, the steady rustle of the clerk flipping through papers, and my heartbeat, clear and deliberate. Walter sat across the table, cold, rigid, like a stone statue. Lorraine wore a pale gray outfit, her eyes dry and empty. Mason wasn't there. They said the boy wasn't emotionally stable enough to attend. I didn't argue. I wasn't here to hurt a child. I was here to make it clear that the adults had chosen to abandon the pain. The hearing began. Their lawyer spoke first. His voice was slow, sharp, never faltering. My client is the victim of baseless accusations that have caused severe harm to his career, finances, and private life. I didn't look at him. I looked straight at Walter. Not a single twitch. The man who once sat across from me in my living room, sipping tea I'd poured for him, now sat there as if he'd never known who I was. Jacob stood up and played the footage. No embellishment, no commentary. Mason, 14 years old, slipped something into the door gap. The door shut. I disappeared from the frame. No sound came from the courtroom. The judge took notes without lifting her head. Walter frowned. Lorraine looked down at the floor. I kept my eyes forward. For the first time in years, I looked without asking for permission. When it was my turn to testify, I walked to the stand. My heart no longer raced. I didn't need to take a deep breath. I had survived far worse. I began slowly. That day, I did not fall. I was pushed out onto the balcony, and the door was locked behind me. I couldn't get back in, and I fell from the second floor. I don't blame the child. I'm not here for revenge. I'm here to ask why no one called for help when I was lying there, my back broken, unable to move, while they just stood and watched. My voice wasn't loud. It didn't shake. It was a statement and a cut. When I returned to my seat, Lorraine shifted slightly as if to speak, but then she just exhaled and lowered her head. At the end of the session, the judge declared the court grants the motion to open a financial, ethical, and guardianship investigation into Mr. and Mrs. Kingsley and suspends the operations of Kingsley and Associates pending the investigation. No one clapped. No one hugged me. But I didn't need that. I stood, nodded at Jacob, and walked slowly through the courthouse hallway, where sunlight streamed through the old wooden windows, laying across my back. Walter didn't turn his head. Lorraine didn't speak. And I didn't look at them again. I walked straight through the big doors. And for the first time since the day of the fall, I felt the ground under my feet was real. I left the courthouse a little after 4 in the afternoon. No reporters, no crowd, just the pale sunlight brushing over the stone steps, and that strange feeling that no one was standing over me anymore. I kept walking, didn't speak to Jacob, didn't turn my phone back on. I just wanted to feel every step with my feet and with my heart. This victory wasn't what I imagined. It wasn't loud. It didn't burn through my anger. It didn't tear the night wide open. It came quietly, and it left a hollow space. That evening, I sat in Mrs. Connors's living room, which she'd recovered, though she still needed a cane to walk. She didn't ask if I had won. She just handed me a cup of hot tea and asked, "Are you still afraid I told her the truth?" I'm not afraid of them anymore. I'm just afraid that, after everything, I still don't know who I am. She nodded, then replied as if speaking to herself, "You're a survivor, and surviving isn't about revenge. It's about understanding why you're still here." That night, I slept without dreams. No nightmares, but no peace either. Just a smooth, blank sleep, as if my body was quietly mending. All the broken places that never had a name. A few days later, Walter left the company. Lorraine quietly disappeared from social media. "Mason, I heard you transferred schools, and he's now in therapy. I didn't feel happy. I didn't feel sad. I just felt right. No one escapes consequences forever. Not even me. I used to think I'd feel triumphant when they fell, but I realized I felt nothing at all because I wasn't in that race anymore. One afternoon, I went back to the old street, the one where the balcony had once swallowed me whole. The house had been sold. The facade was repainted. The sliding doors were replaced with modern glass ones. No trace left. I stood in the street, looking up. Something tightened slightly in my chest, not because of lingering trauma, but because that was where I'd been pushed out of everything I thought was safe. A little girl inside the house opened the door and looked at me, curly hair, big eyes. A stranger? I smiled and walked away. I didn't belong there anymore. I wrote a short note in my old journal. No one will ever push me again, but no one will hold me either. So from now on, I'll hold myself. That was the only thing I carried out of this journey. Not property, not reputation, just wholeness. And I know, one day, I'll forgive Lorraine, not because she deserves it, but because I don't want her shadow in the days I have left. I looked at an old photo of me standing next to Lorraine at a winter party, both of us smiling. I didn't tear it. I didn't burn it. I just tucked it into the very last drawer of the cabinet, a place for things that have passed, but never need to be repeated. I moved out on a quiet morning. No warning, no grand goodbyes, just a few boxes of books, an old suitcase, and a heart as light as a door that's just closed behind me. I moved to a small town up north, near the lake, where hardly anyone knows me. No one here asks about the trial, about Lorraine, or about Mason. No one looks at me like the famous victim. I like it that way. The apartment I rented is small, just enough space for a desk by the window and a worn-out armchair I bought from the thrift store. Every morning, I wake early, make tea, and open the window. The wind doesn't bring answers, but it reminds me I'm still alive, and I still have choices. I took a part-time job at the town library, a place that smells of old paper and warm silence. No one needs to know I once sat in a courtroom. I just need to remember how to listen, not to argue, but to understand. Once, a freshman girl asked me, "Did you study law?" I laughed softly. I studied how to keep quiet, and then I learned how to break it. I've kept very few things from my old life. No case files, no newspaper clippings, just a notebook where I once wrote, "If I stay silent, who will speak for me? I did speak up." And now, I don't need to shout anymore. I no longer count what I've lost. I've started counting what I've chosen to keep: clarity, patience, and the right to leave without asking anyone's permission. Lorraine never reached out again. I don't expect her to. But one afternoon, I got an envelope with no sender's name. Inside was a folded piece of paper. No greeting, no signature, just 8 handwritten words. "You stood wrong." I stood up. I don't know if it was from her, but I kept it. Like a period. Not to reconnect, but to close. I often walk around the lake in the evenings. I like standing at that spot where the water reflects the sky the closest. Not to see myself, but to remind myself I'm no longer afraid of disappearing into someone else. Sometimes I meet strange women who glance at me quietly, some walking with children, some with eyes that have once been broken. We don't always speak, but I know they recognize me, and they see something in me other than victory. but the ability to exist after everyone thought I couldn't. I don't know what the future will be. I only know this time. I hold the key. No one shoves me off a balcony. No one speaks for me. No one decides if I'm worthy of trust. I've been through enough to understand forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's allowing yourself to keep living without carrying that pain anymore. One weekend morning, I opened my notebook and wrote, "This story doesn't need a pretty ending. It just needs the right one." I closed the notebook, and for the first time in years, my heart felt as still as the lake's surface. Thank you for walking with me to the very end. If you've ever felt pushed out of your own life, silenced, or fallen with no one to catch you, then Naomi's story is also a part of yours. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from the courtroom. It comes from the moment you dare to say, "I'm here. I'm not silent anymore." If this story touches something in you, leave a comment. Share this video with someone you think needs a reason to stand up. And don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Mark so you won't miss the next stories where those who were once left behind will finally have their stories told the way they deserve. You are not alone. And you don't have to stay silent forever.